for the highways of America, which for so many years were an assortment of as many designs and pavements as there were states, are now becoming one big road that can take you anywhere faster, safer, and more directly than ever before. What is this big road? Where is it going? How much has been built? How much is yet to come? These are questions we ask. Certainly traveling the entire system would be a memorable experience, but few of us have the time for such a trip.
Hey everyone, Eric here. Did you know that Viking Dog Entertainment has our very own apparel line? Motivational shirts including our mantra, Never Doubt Your Power, which are not only a fun, inspirational line of clothing, but also give back. A portion of the proceeds of each of these motivational shirts are donated to wolf rescue organizations. And what's more, we have a special line of wolf-related shirts that provide 100% of their proceeds to wolf rescue. You can choose from a number of designs including Save the Wolves, Leader of the Pack, or I Love Wolves. And every penny of profit from these shirts will be donated directly to wolf rescue. So visit thevikingdogstore.com and get your shirts today. Perfect for the gym or just wearing on a daily basis, we have men's, women's, and even shirts for kids. Motivate your workout and help us help save these amazing animals. thevikingdogstore.com.
Good day, everyone. We're coming on the air to bring you the latest on Hurricane Michael, now bearing down on the Florida Panhandle. It is now a Category 4 storm, although moving close to 5, the most powerful storm on record.
Climate change is now rapid, widespread, and intensifying. That is according to a devastating report by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which warns that many human-caused effects are now irreversible.
This is what's been happening all day. People being rescued. This video just came in a couple of hours ago, showing people in Laplace, Louisiana being rescued by boat, ATVs, helicopters, and high water vehicles.
Crippling drought across multiple states. The alarming images tonight of Lake Mead at the Hoover Dam. It's part of the Colorado River system, the water supply for 40 million Americans.
Scientists say Antarctica's ice is melting 6 times faster than it was 40 years ago. Now, according to a new report, the melting of the protective ice sheet could lead to an exponential rise in the sea level, possibly within the next century. Now,
UN Secretary General called the findings a code red for humanity, adding that it must be a death knell for coal and fossil fuels.
A new report says climate change is a growing target for false news and misinformation. According to Axios, climate change is the easiest news to fake, and that's partly because climate change is intangible and sometimes a controversial topic.
Climate change. For the longest time, the argument was, is it real or not? But it really seems that the argument has changed into something completely different at this point. Matter of fact, there's more than one argument now. There's the obvious, what do we do about it? How do we prep for it? Can we change it? But there's another argument as to who's to blame that still goes on. It seems like it's this idea that if people can shuffle it off, then somehow it's not as bad. You know, I hear people saying, well, it's cyclical, well, it's not human-made, well, it's this, it's that. It doesn't change the fact that it's here. So if you want to have that argument, that's a whole other discussion to have. But we're going to talk about how do we prep for it, and how do we get ready, and where do we go from here. My guest today is Professor Stephen Wheeler. Professor Wheeler is part of the Landscape Architecture program at the Department of Human Ecology at UC Davis. He is a scholar in the area of climate change, environmental design, and I'm really excited that he could join me for this discussion today. Professor Wheeler, it's great to have you here. Thanks for taking time to discuss what is a very important topic, and I think a topic that too often is either above the discussion or below the discussion. So I'm hoping we can meet somewhere in the middle and have a great discussion that brings up some of the topics that everyone's interested in a way that everyone can really conceive and really address. So really, to begin, can you tell me a bit about your work and what area of climate change is your expertise?
Well, thank you for having me, Eric. I have been working in different ways since I was a college student to try to bring about the vision of sustainable cities, to try to figure out how we have communities that are going to work long term, both ecologically, socially, economically, various other ways. And I first got involved as a student activist way back in college. Then I worked in DC for a decade with Friends of the Earth and other groups like that. And then in the Bay Area, I was one of the founders of the regional sort of smart growth, livable community, social equity coalition there. And for the last 15, 20 years, I've been in academia. So I take a very holistic view of cities and of sustainability. And in fact, it kind of requires that sort of holistic view. We have to have systems that don't just thrive in one dimension, but in all dimensions. Now, climate change is, of course, driving much of the sustainability work these days. And if we don't surmount the climate challenge, we may not have much else to do. But so that is something that I have focused a lot on in the last 10 or 15 years. I am particularly interested in how we get to carbon neutrality, how we end use of fossil fuels, because that's the dimension of climate work that is the big hurdle. Now, we also have to adapt, certainly, and we also have to address the social justice, the environmental justice dimensions of the climate crisis, because global warming will hit the least advantaged communities the hardest worldwide. So that deserves lots of attention. And I've been doing work recently looking at heat and how that tends to impact poor neighborhoods and communities of color much more than affluent white neighborhoods for various reasons. So that's one aspect of the adaptation problem. But how we mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, how we get to carbon neutrality is really the top of my list.
So can we stop there, pause that for a second? And there's so many different directions we can go at this point. But one thing I would love for you to address is two terms that come up in climate change discussion a lot, and you mentioned both of them. The first is an easy term to address and define: sustainability. Can you briefly just define what that means in the achievement of dealing with climate change?
Well, sustainability is a term that's been around since the 1970s, and many people think it's so vague and broad as to be meaningless. But it actually reflects some very different ways of thinking long-term, for one, thinking holistically, thinking across different goals, having a healthy society, a healthy economy, and a healthy environment, and thinking proactively. None of us is an observer. We're all in this picture together. We all need to pitch in and bring sustainability about. The term could be defined as moving towards long-term ecological and social health or social well-being. There's no one sustainable end state. There's no one sustainable model of a city out there. It's all context dependent. If you have a community in the southwestern US where it's dry and relatively warm, you're going to have a whole lot of different buildings and heating and cooling structures and lots of different elements than if you are talking about a cold Northern European city or African city or Asian city. Um, so it is this process of moving towards greater ecological and social health. Now, economic health, of course, is a part of society. So, that's got to be a part of the picture too, but it is really a subset of society. And the problem is that in the 20th century world, the economic goals became paramount and the environmental and social goals often got left behind. So we have communities that just are not working very well right now.
And there's, I think one of the issues that when you hear the term sustainability, I think a lot of people automatically jump to economics and they say, well, we have to have a sustainable economy. We have to have a sustainable workforce. We have to have a sustainable money flow, instead of thinking about it on a broader scale, like you say, that everybody, it's going to be different for somebody in the United States versus Africa. It's more than just economics. It's also about mental health. It's all about um, uh, general health. It's everything, which actually leads me to the other term that I'd love for you to define, is holistic, because I think there is, especially in some more conservative circles, I can speak of people in my own life, when they hear the term holistic, they think crystals and they think they think holistic medicine, and they suddenly think that it's this touchy-feely kind of thing, but it's not. It's a scientific term. So if you could address that and just define it more in a scientific way, I think that would be a great thing for the discussion.
Yeah, we could use other words as well. We could talk about thinking in systems. We could talk about being interdisciplinary, or better yet, transdisciplinary. The root of the problem is that the 20th century was a time in which people specialized. We had great and wonderful growth of lots of professions, of science, but the feeling was that people should burrow in and become experts in just one thing and should leave the decision making to other people and should just produce knowledge on that one subject. And there was a lot of fragmentation of disciplines. And in my own field of urban planning, that had very practical results, because the people building the highways didn't think about how that was going to change the land use around the highways, or the air quality, or the social equity, as rich folks moved some places and poor folks got left other places, and black and white and so forth. And not thinking about all those different implications through the whole context led to a lot of really big problems. Ranging from social segregation to air pollution in Southern California to global warming. And now we realize we have to think much more broadly, much more contextually. So for me, sustainability is really a transition in mindsets. It's a transition in worldviews. And it's not about technology. It's not about some perfect technology that's going to save us, whether it's an electric car or a wind turbine or genetically modified organisms or anything else. It's growing as a species, growing cognitively, and being able to understand the world around us in some better ways, and also each other, and acknowledging and embracing diversity as part of that, other people who are different from ourselves. So it is a broader, more transdisciplinary, more empathetic, if you will, way of thinking.
Which brings us to one of your points that I saw in one of your videos, is there's the myth that there's a one size all solution for everyone across the board. And you have two amazing examples, and I would urge anyone to search out the video. The two examples you use are electric cars in Virginia, and I live in California, so I chuckle at the other one. is high-speed rail in California. While one might work in another place, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good solution for that region. And I think it's a wonderful way that you approach it, and it really does explain part of the problem. Could
Yeah.
you get into that a little bit?
Sure. Let me pick up on the electric car example a bit. We are all, hopefully going to be driving electric vehicles in a few years, if we're not already, because that will greatly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they're fun, they're wonderful. You drive one, it accelerates very rapidly, better performance in many ways than gas-powered cars. So what's not to like? But if you drive an electric vehicle in West Virginia or Virginia or a place where most of the electricity is generated by coal, your greenhouse gas emissions are going to be just about as high as if you were burning fossil fuels directly. And that's really different than if you're in the West Coast or increasingly some other parts of the country where most of the electricity is coming from renewable sources. Mm-hmm. Even if we could get renewable energy everywhere, if you have ever-ending growth in electric vehicle use, you're going to have big sustainability problems. The cities and towns are going to be clogged with cars. They're going to make it more and more unpleasant to be on the streets. People are going to not want their kids to be walking on the sidewalks, or people are going to die in accidents. And it's a quality of life issue that is going to be less sustainable. So with any technology, there's many pros and cons, and we have to become more aware of those. We have to get our heads around all the different aspects, which admittedly demands a fair bit of us, but hey, we can do it. And it's a learning process that we can all support one another in.
Why is there still, and I know you deal more with sustainability, you deal more with forward looking, but what is the argument now? Where do we stand with the discussion about how to move forward, in your opinion? In the past it's been doesn't exist, it does exist, it doesn't exist, it does exist. And then it feels like we've reached a point where there's acknowledgement that there is something happening. I always refer to it as the dominion argument, because it seems like there's a lot of people that say, well, it's not man's fault, but something's going on, it's cyclical, don't blame us, but we'll deal with it. So I call it the dominion argument, because it's the man's dominion over land, and that God's going to be mad because they screwed it up. But if we take that out of the equation, what's holding everyone back from making these types of changes and really starting to implement things that can help reach carbon neutrality or urban development that's going to help? What's standing in the way?
The short answer is a power structure that benefits from the situation as it's structured now, including fossil fuel companies and many others. Now, attached to that is a political, unfortunately, right-wing structure in the US that benefits from the status quo, and that somehow has latched onto this issue as something to gain votes from in a very unfortunate populist way. But I think the situation is changing. First of all, lots of people are doing great stuff in their own lives, and lots of businesses and institutions are doing great things in terms of reducing their emissions. But even the fossil fuel companies are starting to acknowledge in their mainly advertising that there is a problem, and instead of denying the problem, they are starting to try to frame it in other ways, such as, okay, we'll just sequester emissions, or we'll move towards slightly cleaner fuels, or other types of relatively self-serving messages. Mm-hmm. Worldwide, there's no doubt that the climate crisis is on people's minds and is being responded to creatively by probably the majority of the world's population. We do, though, have all these entrenched institutions that benefit from things not changing. So we have to kind of leverage some change there. I personally would love to see the fossil fuel companies nationalized, that is, having national governments take them over and then gradually wean them off fossil fuels onto other things that would be way more productive.
That's a
I
tough
don't think that's
battle.
going to happen anytime soon in the US.
Yeah, yeah.
I would also love to see states such as California or others take over electric utilities and help speed that conversion. And that is actually happening in various ways, not directly by state governments, but many cities and towns worldwide have done and are doing right now something called community choice energy, which is they decide that the local utility is not doing enough to move away from fossil fuels. So they form a county-wide or city-wide buying agency, basically, to buy renewable energy and make that the default choice for anybody who hooks up their house or their building to the grid.
So it sounds like it really has to be a grassroots effort, though. It can't be, a federal agency isn't going to make these changes happen.
Well, it's got to be a mix. A lot of it has to be grassroots, but there also needs to be top-down stuff. Basic regulations like, do we allow people to buy incandescent light bulbs? That is done from the top most easily. And nations like Australia and Brazil have basically outlawed incandescent light bulbs. And we haven't done it in the US, but we certainly could. Setting efficiency standards for appliances and for motor vehicles, something that's much more easily done from the top. Getting the hundreds of thousands of local governments in the US to agree on efficiency standards would be impossible.
But you have situations like California, where California does these types of things. California sets emission standards. California leads the nation in many ways, and they're fought in that. On a federal level, certain administrations will literally sue the state and say, you cannot do that. You cannot, there is a pushback. So it's the oldest story, as I guess as old as government has been around. One goes against the other, but what happens? What happens there?
Well, this is where we need to, I think, all become a bit more aware of the power structure that runs our society. And power structure is too simple a term. It's the evolving networks of power, because we do not have a very good democracy in this country. And I think, most people are aware of that these days. How do we actually get there? How do we improve it? If you look at public opinion polls across the board, Democrats, Republicans, both tend to support many of the things we're talking about, dealing with the climate crisis, for example. But the particular institutions of national government have been jury-rigged to lead to other results and to make change extremely difficult. The filibuster, of course, is in discussion this year, and the gerrymandering of legislative districts and so forth. So the power structure doesn't reflect where people are overall. Right. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem.
Now we're trying to stay optimistic in this conversation. I'm trying to stay optimistic, and I know you seem to do that as well. But is there a tipping point where it goes from trying to fix things to just trying to survive and just trying to deal?
That's a very good question.
When instead of being proactive, it's more protective.
Yeah, and some jurisdictions are at that tipping point. Miami is probably getting pretty close because Miami is about, on average, something like 6 feet above sea level. And it's going to have to figure out something already, even on non-stormy days. Seawater is coming up through the storm drain system.
Yeah.
So it depends on where you are. In California, exurban communities in the Sierra foothills, have to think differently about fire, because they will burn if they don't do something.
Yeah.
And we may need to think very differently about drought. Um, so we're getting to that point where life's going to have to change and institutions are going to have to change in some pretty big ways. But it's spotty so far. And 10 or 20 or 30 years down the line, we're going to be much more, the world is going to be in that situation.
But do you see hope with with the next generation? Because I know that I see the younger generation being aware of what's going on, or at least it seems like they've been born into this situation and they're not happy with it, which you can't blame them.
Yeah.
But do you see that as a hopeful thing?
Yes, I am hopeful in the long run. I'm not sure I'm hopeful in the very short run. The next elections, for example, I don't know. But um, in the long run, we will learn as a species. Um, the question is how much we suffer in the meanwhile. We will look back on it and we will see the early 21st century as being a time that was dominated by certain forms of denial and certain forms of power that prevented cultures from doing what they needed to do. And hopefully we will have put in place protections so that that doesn't happen again. Um, and we may not allow a company like ExxonMobil to emerge in the same way that it has in the last 100 years. So we will get there. It's a question of how quickly our minds change and evolve to do that.
The Open Highway podcast is available through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Player FM, and all the places that you get your favorite podcasts. I got to read a little bit of your new book, and in it you talk about some of the levels of how to move on, what needs to be done. Can we chat about that a little bit, about what, like, I think too often when whether you're watching the talking head on the news, or you're hearing the public quote unquote discourse about what's going on, we don't that's so emotionally driven. And I think something that really jumped out at me about what I read is, it's like, here's what it is. Here's what we have to do. There's no emotion, there's no blame, it's just, if we do X, Y, and Z will happen.
Mhm.
So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what are the steps that need to happen to reach carbon neutrality? Or if unfortunately it has to get to the point where it's the tipping point that we discussed, where changes need to be made in urban development.
Sure.
So what are those?
Well, the new book, first of all, is called Reimagining Sustainable Cities. And I wrote it with Christina Rosen, who teaches at Temple University in Philadelphia. And it's called Reimagining because the first generation of thinking about sustainable cities often focused on solar energy and very green houses and buildings and photovoltaics and electric cars and some other neat technologies that were very attractive, and also restoration of some environments in cities. But that didn't really get to the systems underneath, the power structures underneath the city. So for the second generation of thinking about sustainable cities, um, the need is to think in terms of structural change, to think in terms of the structures of democracy, of the economy that drive society, and how those can move us towards sustainability. So the book is basically a call to think on that systemic level, and not just in terms of sort of the lovely veneer of green cities. Now on climate, how we solve the climate problem, it's basically not rocket science at this point. We electrify everything. We electrify homes, we electrify cars, we electrify factories and industry. And then we generate the electricity all from renewable sources. And luckily, the economics of wind power and solar power and other things has changed radically in the last generation and is now the cheapest form.
Mhm.
So we'd actually be saving money by doing this too. Um, and there are all sorts of technical fixes to, okay, how do you even the flow of renewable electricity day and night, and when it's windy and not. Um, but the Electric Society, then there will be other things and that's really the easiest part. Changing lifestyles a bit, reducing consumption, reducing, changing diets, reducing our consumption of meat, particularly, and dairy. Um, and is another second very important change. Then rethinking agriculture a bit to reduce emissions from agriculture, rethinking um, every dimension of society to look at all the different potentially global warming chemicals that are produced and substituting. It may sound like a lot, but it's not quite as overwhelming as one might think on a technical level.
On a personal level, though, that before you go on, I think the difficult part, tell me if you agree, is people don't like, they see that, whether or not it's true, they see it as, well, you're taking away the comfort in my life. This is what I've gotten used to. This is the way I live. Why should I give that up, even for a grander scale? And I think even during COVID, I think we've seen a little bit of a glimmer of the good and the bad in people when they're asked to give up certain things and comfort in their life. So how do you convince somebody then, short of the storms that are rolling in, that, like, look, you need to think about the greater good, just because you and give up the fact that you're going to have to get an electric car, or you're not going to have the muscle car that you used to have, or you might not be able to eat as much meat as whatever. How do you appeal to people?
Well, much of the comfort that we have is going to be the same. It's not going to change. If you have an electric car, you're going to go 0 to 60, if that's what you want to do, faster than in a gas car. My Chevy Bolt will do 0 to 60, not that I do it too often, in about 6 seconds. And, what more do you need?
Yeah.
In terms of, a comfortable home, an electric heat pump will do exactly the same thing as a gas furnace. There's just no difference.
I think these are the myths. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, like, would you agree that these are the myths that are perpetuated by the power structure that you had discussed earlier?
Yeah.
That's what I'm kind of saying.
Well, there may need to be some changes. So there's one set of things that's going to be exactly the same. And those are the things that matter the most. Now, are we going to be able to commute daily from San Francisco to LA if our home is in San Francisco or the Bay Area and our job is in LA? Or are we going to be able to be British people, live in Britain and commute every weekend to southern Spain where we have our condo by airplane? Well, that's going to be much more difficult to deal with, because there is no easy substitute for the jet airplane in terms of zero emissions. But we can ask, is commuting, from San Francisco to LA every day for your job really a healthy lifestyle? And is that really comfort? Is that really what people need? And maybe we need to live more locally. And maybe our quality of life will be higher if we do that. Maybe we'll have more time with our kids and, with our wife or our partner, and with our local community. Maybe we'll get more involved and actually help take care of things locally. So I think there's some very healthy rethinking of lifestyle that can take place.
Can you answer a question? Can you answer a question for me that you just made me think of? The concept of, and I know I don't have the right term, but when you carbon footprint, and when a company actually pays for, like, the airplane thing, and they pay there's a term for it, and I'm totally forgetting it right now. When they fly their plane somewhere and they say, well, we offset it because we paid for the carbon. You don't remember either, right? It doesn't happen as much as it used to. It used to be a very big thing. Is that valid?
Well, carbon offsets are a pretty big deal right now. You mentioned that. Um, the idea that, okay, we'll take our air trip anyway and generate a lot of emissions, but we'll spend $20 helping preserve the Brazilian rainforest or something like that. That's a pretty dicey proposition. And there's a lot of problems with that idea that we can basically, it's like in the Middle Ages, in the Catholic Church, people paid indulgences and they got their sins forgiven. Well, let's face it, you just don't want to go on sinning. I mean, depending on what the sin is, of course, but and if you pay $20 to save part of the Brazilian rainforest, there's really not a lot of certainty that it's actually going to do that, or it couldn't have happened anyway through another mechanism. And at some point, we all just have to reduce our emissions, period, and not think we can pay our way out of it.
It almost feels like guilt money at a certain point, if I'm being honest, but
Yeah.
if you have that much money to fly the plane, I guess you have the money to have the guilt money in there, or the green indulgences, we could call them, I guess. So we were discussing, and that just popped up. I would really want to address that. So moving forward, I like the idea that this could actually not just help us in a climate way, but it could actually help us in a societal way. That's a very interesting concept.
Absolutely. Designing cities around the human being instead of the motor vehicle has huge pluses in terms of public health. Let's face it, we have a society that has a lot of diabetes, a lot of overweight, a lot of heart disease, a lot of problems that are huge financial and personal burdens for people. And part of it is because we're sitting in our cars way too much. Now, cars are not going to go away. And okay, we love the independence, we love the mobility, but we don't need to have our use of them exponentially increasing indefinitely, and it can't. It's physically impossible.
Yeah.
So let's figure out a sane balance that lets us also get out and walk and bike and meet our neighbors and get some air and be healthy.
Yeah, because you're right though too. Because I will admit I financially not in a situation to have a McLaren, but it would be nice. But I am a fan of cars and learning about them and what they can do. And I do know that, you're absolutely correct. Your battery electric powered car 0 to 60 is as good as anything else. Ford Mustang has the new electric car that's out there that's just as powerful as any other muscle car. The excuses seem to be coming slower and slower and fewer, and it just seems as if they're getting really, really old, and there's no reason for them, and then you start to hear the really dumb ones like, oh, I'm sure we've all heard the windmills cause cancer, or those silly things. And it just gets to a point where you have to wonder what's left from just keeping people to be like, you know what, there's no more excuses. I give, you're right. I don't know. Help me.
Well, that's an excellent observation, and that we are running out of excuses not to do things differently. Change is generational, Eric, I think. And I think, younger generations particularly are just going to see through their elders' excuses. And they already do on a lot of issues. You take gay marriage or something like that. Well, people fought that tooth and nail for generations. And for younger folks, it's like, what's a big deal? People should marry who they want to marry. But I think also in terms of hopefully generating greenhouse gases and wasting quite so much stuff, the kids coming up in school now will have a different mindset.
Do you deal as a professor? You're dealing mostly with grad students and PhD students, is that correct?
No, I have a lot of undergrads
too?
Yeah, I teach at UC Davis, and it's about 2/3 undergrads here. And
You personally, you actually have them in your classes?
oh yeah.
How are they responding? What do they bring to the class? Like, what is their discussion when you have these talks with them? What do you hear from them?
I actually like undergrads in many cases better than grad students because they're more open. They're more hopeful.
They're not jaded yet.
Yeah. um, God for, or like some of the faculty. They really are thinking about some pretty different ways of doing things. And yeah, then they get into the professions, and we all have to sort of make our own adaptations to the way the world is, but they have some really creative alternatives, and some of them are going to go through life, skateboarding or doing other types of things that are not what their parents did. And many of them, they're vegans, or they are more open in terms of gender, or lots of, more open in terms of having friends who are different races or ethnic groups. That's very healthy. So I think generational change may be what saves us in the end.
Do you have some that are just kind of like, ugh, this is what I was given, and they blame their parents or they blame the generations before, and they have kind of a aggression about, not aggression, that's the wrong term, a malaise about it?
Sure, and some are very depressed. We try to always show them hopeful ways that they can educate themselves and make a living and not be depressed. I have students who, have served in the armed forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, and have returned and are trying to make sense of this experience that they have just had. And often it has really led them to rethink things. And it's fascinating working with students. I used to teach in New Mexico, at the University of New Mexico. I had lots of Indian students, and their perspective was just quite different, rooted in, millennia of local history, because some of their villages had been in the same place for thousands of years, and their time frame was longer. So lots of wonderful things one learns from students and kids. And one question for society is, how do we keep that open mindset? How do we keep that open road in front of us, to use the name of your show, and keep that creativity and openness as we go about being adults?
So how do we?
Well,
You've asked the question.
Challenging ourselves, I think. Challenging ourselves, listening to new things, reading new things, talking to new people, asking tough questions. That's part of what makes life fun and creative, is not just sitting in one, becoming a lump on the couch, but pushing ourselves a little bit every day.
Would you still be her big soldier?
He ordered us to sterilize the women.
An entire agenda to wipe my bloodline from a nation because of who I am.
It's what you want to believe.
The award-winning film from Viking Dog Entertainment.
You destroyed their lives and I knew them! And then you did it! I didn't do it!
I don't believe you. Are you an evil man? Or are you just a man who did evil things?
Truth. Available on streaming platforms, Blu-ray, and DVD. So what could, and this seems a little simple, but I'll do what I can do, but what is one thing that somebody can do on a small scale? Let's start with small scale, to help with sustainability to help move forward? Like you just said a wonderful thing about having the discourse and having the discussion and actually opening yourself up to new ideas. But what's something small that somebody could do to help?
Learn about your community. Learn how it works, what's there, walk around it, observe it, learn how the environment has changed. What did the landscape look like before this town was built or the city? What might it look like down the line? Also, of course, talk to people, learn who's there, what different kinds of people, what their issues are, what they care about. Learn about your house, how it functions. How much energy do you use? How much water do you use? What are you eating every day? And where did that come from? Just learn about your life and how it connects to everything else. And then maybe, okay, you can figure out ways to improve it or to get involved with some local group or some bunch of friends or neighbors to do something. There's all sorts of local ecological restoration projects and social service and food truck and homeless related projects. And every community has tons of stuff going on. So start locally.
I think that's such an interesting answer, because there was a time, not too distant past. I mean, I can remember it as a child when you did that. You knew your neighbors and you knew your community and you knew where your food came from, and and it seems like we've gotten away from that. I'm hoping, from what I hear from the younger generation, that they're going back to that. They want to know how their food was made, and did it come from a good source? Was it organic? Was it not? What was used on it? So I think that's a really wonderful piece of advice. So that's a nice small thing that we can all do. Now, personally, I get a little impatient and I like to rock the boat. So on a larger scale, if somebody's like, that's not enough, what can somebody do on a larger scale that really can cause change? And I'm not saying revolution, I'm just saying, what's something that somebody can do to really say, I'm done, I'm not going to take it anymore, I want to cause some change?
Well, first of all, while you're doing local stuff, educate yourself about the other scales of action going on. Read a newspaper or look at stuff online, or learn about all the scales of action and learn who is doing what. Start building your mental roadmap of who does what in the world, what sorts of nonprofit organizations or for-profit organizations or government agencies do what kinds of things. And then what issues are they currently grappling with? And talk to people, do information interviews. For people who are students, okay, you can often do internships or, short bits of volunteer time, different places, and get your foot in the door somewhere. And then I think the options start appearing if you look for them. I mean, what I did when I was 21 years old and graduated from college and wanted to change the world, I just simply put all my stuff in a suitcase and got on the train and went down to Washington, D.C. and started and walked in the door of every organization that I thought might be interesting to work for, and tried to find out what they did and who was there and what the vibe was, and eventually did get an internship in one that paid a little bit, and then turned that into a job. And the way you really get involved in things is to talk to people and to network until you get a role and that's meaningful. So if you really want to work in state government in California, okay, well, maybe you start doing that in Sacramento, or you could do it online, or you could go there, or you could work with local chapters of organizations. There are all sorts of national and international organizations that have local chapters. So there's no one answer, but I would encourage your listeners to just educate we all of us have to educate ourselves and to keep educating ourselves and to keep looking and asking questions and looking, where is there an opportunity? Where is there a door open right now?
Yeah.
And hey, if it's open a bit, let's open it further and talk to people and see if we can get in it.
It seems like, I mean, it's almost obvious because you're in education, but it seems like the recurring theme that we keep coming back to is learning and communication is just at the core of so many of these issues, whether it's the argument in the past going back, like you said, going back to the 50s when this was first really identified on the larger scale, having the discussions, listening to other people and listening, because there's a difference between hearing and listening. There's a difference between acknowledging and dismissing. So, having these discussions, being open to new ideas, learning about other people, learning about what's going on, learning why something works in your area, but maybe not in another area, and not forcing what you believe is correct for your area, the California, Virginia discussion, for example, is looking at the larger picture. And I think sometimes you can agree or disagree, but I think sometimes we have a difficulty as Americans looking at the larger picture. I think we get regionalized sometimes. I think we get tribal a little bit on a smaller scale.
Absolutely. And much of that is natural. Okay, we all have, pretty limited sphere around us, our home, our neighborhood, our workplace, our school. So it's natural for us to focus on that. But in this country, we are such a big country and we take ourselves so seriously that we often don't realize that people elsewhere in the world are often doing really interesting stuff, and that we can learn from them. And we have this idea that they need to learn from us, and that's that. But really, every place in the world can learn from every place else. And we are on a small planet. And so that sort of mutual learning mindset, I think, is going to be really important in the future. And you're right, it's a big educational process. We're learning and growing and evolving as a species. You look at like IQ tests and, controlling for all the other changes over the last 100 years, IQs are way higher than they were, like 12, 15 points. We have so much more information. We have so much knowledge. We're not living isolated lives in the country somewhere. We are in this very rich world in terms of information and stimulus. And the trick is to make the best use out of that and not just entertain ourselves to death, but grow, and in ways that promote our own happiness and that deal with these big issues like social inequality or racism or the climate crisis.
I'm going to end it with this because I want to end it on a positive note. And this has been overall, it has been positive. And I have to give you full credit for what could be a very doomsayer conversation. You actually are a very optimistic man, so I give you full credit for that. Deserved. Can you give me a specific example of maybe a company or a group or a product or something where somebody really is doing something to call attention to the subject, or making a change, or doing something where we can kind of highlight it and be like, you know what, there's an example? Is there one that you have?
To me, one of the most inspiring examples was a guy named Ray Anderson, who was the founder and chairman of a very prosaic industry, a carpet company in the southeastern US. I think it was in South Carolina or some state like that. But it became one of the world's largest carpet companies and produced all sorts of the rugs that you see in offices and universities and large institutions. Well, he decided that he was tired of producing products that, basically filled up landfills after a few years, and decided to make his business totally sustainable. And they pioneered things like having these institutional carpets made in squares where you could replace one square if it got worn or a stain or something like that, rather than digging and taking up the whole carpet on the floor and putting down a new one. Also making them out of different materials, making his business more responsive to workers and socially responsible in that way. And he was immensely inspirational to a lot of people. So one very mainstream person in a for-profit business turned a whole lot of things around. His carpet company again was named Interface, and he passed unfortunately in 2011, but in one lifetime he made an enormous difference.
So just by looking at the situation differently.
Yes.
And approaching it differently.
Yes.
He was able to change the entire way of doing a certain type of business.
Yes, and he got named a hero of the environment by Time magazine and Forbes, and he got a lot of recognition for it. And he inspired a lot of people.
And it's such a simple thing. I'm sure if it was that simple, anyone would have thought of it. But it's not like he had to reinvent the wheel. It's not like he wasn't some huge chemistry thing. It wasn't nuclear physics. He looked at a problem and said, why can't we do this differently with basically a simple approach, and changed a whole industry. Because I know exactly what you're talking. I've seen those types of carpets, and I'm guessing he's not the only company that has done something after that. I'm sure that people have implemented that as well. So,
yeah, you take it, whatever line of work one is in, there's always something that can be done. And you may need to push a little bit. You may need to get people used to ideas. You may need to phase them in a bit. It's going to depend on the context, as we've said many times, but there's a way to make things happen. And becoming leaders in that way is something we encourage our students a lot to do, but all of us, need to pursue.
Professor Wheeler, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I've learned a lot, and I feel very optimistic. I feel more optimistic than I did at the beginning of the conversation. So thank you for that. And remind me the name of your book again.
Reimagining Sustainable Cities will be out fall 2021 from UC Press.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope we get to talk again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Best of luck with your podcast.
Thank you much.
All rights reserved. Viking Dog 2021.